Something strange happened at Wimbledon after Alex left. The tournament kept going. The matches kept being played. The scores kept being posted, and the rankings kept being updated, and the draw kept narrowing toward its conclusion the way it always does. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. People were talking about the player, who was no longer there. Not in a sad way. Not in the way fans sometimes mourn a favorite who exits early and leaves a gap in the bracket. They were talking about her the way you talk about something that changed the feeling of a room, something whose absence makes you realize for the first time how present it was. The conversation around Wimbledon had quietly reorganized itself around a 21-year-old from Quezon City who had already packed her bags and gone home. And that says something about Alex that a scoreline, or a ranking, or even a historical record cannot quite capture. Let's go back to the beginning of the fortnight, because the atmosphere she created at the All England Club did not appear fully formed. It built. It started quietly, and it grew with every match she won. And by the time her run ended in the fourth round, what she had created inside one of the most tradition-bound sporting venues in the world was something that the people who worked there said they had not experienced before in quite that way. The first signs showed up in the practice courts. Practice courts at Wimbledon are usually the domain of the genuinely devoted, the hardcore fans who arrive early enough to watch players warm up before the scheduled matches begin. A few rows of spectators, a handful of cameras, the occasional murmur of recognition when a well-known name walks out to hit. When Alex went to practice, something different happened. People showed up in numbers that the schedule didn't justify. They lined the available space several rows deep. They waited patiently for routine forehands and backhands and serve drills, the least glamorous tennis imaginable because being in the same space as her felt worth the time. Volunteers and tournament staff, who had worked multiple Wimbledons, started noticing the pattern. Whenever her name appeared anywhere on the day's schedule, the crowd around that court grew beyond what the occasion called for. That kind of attention is not manufactured. Nobody was running a campaign urging people to come watch practice sessions. They came because they wanted to be there because the excitement surrounding Alex had extended far beyond the matches themselves into every corner of the ground she touched. And then there were the flags. If you were at Wimbledon during Alex's run, and you paid attention to the grounds rather than just the courts, you would have noticed them appearing everywhere. Not concentrated in a single section or limited to the areas nearest her matches. Spread throughout the grounds, red and blue and yellow, carried by people who had traveled from the Philippines and from Filipino communities across Europe, and from wherever else the diaspora had gathered for this specific fortnight, because they understood, before most of the wider tennis world caught up, that something historic might be unfolding, and they were not going to watch it from a screen if they could possibly help it. Wimbledon is famously difficult to get into. The queue is one of the most talked about rituals in British sport, people sleeping on pavements through London nights for the chance to buy day tickets that cannot be obtained any other way. Filipino fans who showed up at the All England Club during Alex's run had navigated all of that. They had queued and waited and managed the logistics of getting themselves into a venue where tickets are genuinely scarce, and they had done it because this was the kind of moment that you do not experience secondhand if you have any choice in matter. When Alex won her second-round match and leaned into the microphone to thank them in Tagalog, the response from the stands was the kind of response that makes even people who are not emotionally invested in the result feel something. That is the other thing about what Alex created at Wimbledon, it was not exclusive. The excitement she generated was not limited to the Filipino community that had come to support her, or the tennis purists who had been following her career for months. It spread. It reached people who had no particular connection to the Philippines and no particular history with women's tennis, who tuned in because someone in their feed was talking about her, or because a headline caught their attention, or because the clip from her on-court interview after the Swiatek match found them wherever they were and made them stop and watch the whole thing. That interview is worth dwelling on because it is central to understanding why Alex's Wimbledon became something larger than a tennis result. She stood at the microphone after the biggest win of her career, after beating the defending champion in straight sets on center court, and she talked about being a child, about going to the courts every day after school with her brother and her grandfather. About ruffled socks and shoes that lit up when she walked in chubby cheeks and a love for tennis that had nothing sophisticated about it. It was just hitting a ball with family members and enjoying the feeling of it. She said that for someone like the player she had just beaten, a Grand Slam result might feel like a modest setback. But for someone who grew up where she grew up, in the circumstances she grew up in, it was everything. And then she redirected. She told the crowd she was not satisfied. Let us go. That combination, Complete emotional honesty followed immediately by forward momentum is not something you can coach into a person. It either lives in them, or it does not. In Alex, it clearly does, and the people who watched it recognized something real in it, and they shared it, and found people who had never watched a full tennis match in their lives and made them care about what happened next. That is the mechanism behind what turned a remarkable tennis run into a cultural event. Not marketing, not scheduling, not a favorable draw, or a lucky week. A person being completely genuinely themselves in the moments that mattered most, and those moments being large enough and public enough to reach an audience that extended far beyond the usual boundaries of sport. Back in the Philippines, the viewing figures told their own story. Public watch parties filled with people who had gathered with family and friends to support a player representing their country at a level no Filipino had ever reached before. The tournament was taking place in London, thousands of miles and several time zones away, which meant that many of those gatherings were happening at hours that required real commitment, early mornings or late nights, depending on the round. People showed up anyway. They wore the flag. They watched together. They celebrated together. And when the run finally ended in the fourth round against Paulini, after a three-set battle that went 2 hours and 22 minutes and could have gone either way, the grief that accompanied the result was the particular kind of grief that only comes when the investment was genuine. You do not feel that kind of sadness about something you were only casually interested in. The depth of the disappointment was a direct measure of the depth of the connection. And then, within a fairly short time, the sadness shifted into something else. Pride. Not consolation prize pride. Not the kind of pride people reach for when they are trying to soften a loss. Real, specific pride about what had actually been accomplished, because what had actually been accomplished was genuinely extraordinary. Alex became the first Filipino player in the open era of professional tennis to reach the fourth round of a Grand Slam. She beat the defending champion of Wimbledon on center court. She did it with 21 unforced errors against 44 from one of the most disciplined players in the sport. She saved set points in a first-set tiebreak that lasted 84 minutes before winning it 11-9. She then came back 2 days later and competed for over 2 hours in a fourth-round match against a former Grand Slam finalist. These are not consolation statistics. These are the numbers of a player who belongs at the top of the sport and who spent 2 weeks proving it in the most public and demanding environment available. The fact that the run ended does not diminish any of it. Every run ends. The question is what the run built and what it left behind, and what Alex's Wimbledon left behind is considerable. It left behind a new benchmark for Filipino tennis. Before this summer, no Filipino player had done this. Now one has. The ceiling that was assumed to exist has been demonstrated to be permeable, and that demonstration happened on the most watched courts in sport in front of the largest possible audience. Every kid in the Philippines who picks up a racket from this point forward has a different frame of reference for what is possible, not because someone told them it was possible, because they watched it happen. That is a different kind of permission. You can tell a child that the world is open to them, and they will believe it to the extent that words can convey belief. Or you can show them someone who looked like them and came from where they came from walking onto center court at Wimbledon and beating the defending champion, and they will believe it in a way that goes deeper than words can reach. Alex did the second thing. At Wimbledon 2026, in front of a whole world, she showed the children of the Philippines and of Southeast Asia more broadly what was possible, and that showing is now permanent. It lives in the record books and in the highlight reels and in the memories of everyone who watched it, and it will be there for every player from that part of the world who comes after her and needs to know that the path exists. The way Alex handled her growing fame throughout the tournament was itself part of the story. Because fame at this speed and this scale can do strange things to a person. It can make them perform a version of themselves rather than simply being themselves. It can make them careful and managed and aware of the image they are projecting in a way that drains the authenticity that generated the attention in the first place. Alex did not seem to experience any of that. She remained recognizably herself throughout, the same person in the press conferences as in the on-court interviews as in the casual Instagram story she posted of herself and a friend standing next to the Princess of Wales with a caption that read like someone having the best week of their life and wanting to share it honestly. She signed autographs because she wanted to. She turned up for practice with the same approach she brought to match days. Fellow players talked about her in the way they talk about people they genuinely like rather than people they are professionally obligated to respect, which is a different kind of endorsement and one that matters. Her authenticity became one of her genuine strengths, not because it was a strategy, but because it was not a strategy. She was not trying to be authentic. She was simply being herself, and at this level of public attention, being simply yourself is actually one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can do. The tennis world noticed things about her game that will shape how opponents prepare for her in the future. Her movement is exceptional. She tracks down balls that most players at her level would concede as impossible to reach, and she does it without the desperate, scrambling quality that often accompanies defensive retrieving. She moves with a kind of calm purposefulness that suggests she has already calculated where the ball is going before it arrives. Her anticipation is a significant weapon, even though it does not show up in the statistics the way groundstroke winners do. She makes opponents play one more shot than they expected to have to play, and at the highest level of the sport, that extra shot is often where errors come from. Her tactical intelligence was visible throughout the tournament in the way she constructed points rather than simply hitting through them. The way she used pace and spin and direction to move opponents into positions where their own aggression became a liability. There are also specific areas where she has room to grow, and the most publicly identified one came from one of the most qualified voices in the history of the sport. Martina Navratilova pointed out that Alex's serve is operating well below its potential, that she has the physical tools to hit at speeds significantly beyond what she is currently producing, and that she is not fully exploiting the natural advantages that left-handed serving creates against right-handed opponents. That observation from someone who built one of the most dominant careers in tennis history on a serve and volley game that started with an elite serve is not criticism for its own sake. It is a blueprint. It identifies the specific gap between where Alex is and where she could be, and it does so with the authority of someone who knows from personal experience what that gap costs at the decisive moments of major matches. The hardcourt season begins in Washington in late July, and the U.S. Open follows in late August, where Alex won the junior title in 2022, and where the professional draw will now include a player that every opponent takes seriously and prepares for specifically. She heads into that stretch with the confidence of someone who has been tested at the deepest level of the sport and held up with a community of supporters spanning multiple continents who will be following every point, and with a technical area for improvement so clearly identified that the 3 weeks between Wimbledon and Washington become the most purposeful practice period of her career. The tournament that moved on after she left is still being played. The final will happen, and a champion